There we go. Cool. So we are live. Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So I'm super excited for this. We'll start off a little bit slow because it takes people a little bit of time to kind of pile in, and also just to make sure that everything is good audio wise. We were chatting before we went live about
Hmm.
potential audio issues. Um, and I'd like to see where people are from in the world. But while we're getting
Hmm.
spun up here, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what you're all about.
Yeah, well, I'm Colleen Grotzer, and I have two companies. One is Creative Boost, where I provide accessibility courses, and I also have a consulting business where we do accessibility, and that's called Grotzer Graphics. And I actually got into this by accident in 2016. I didn't even know what accessibility was at the time. And Bevy Chagnon, who has been in the industry for over 30 years doing accessibility, wanted me to take her InDesign accessibility course. So that's how I got into this. And I was also still doing websites at the time. So then I learned website accessibility as well. So, now I do both.
It's a bit of a beast. You said you came into it not knowing anything, and I think that's going to be what
Yes.
most people listening today. That's a broad, sweeping generalization, but I think for the most part, that's probably going to be true, myself
Hmm.
included. And so we do have some people coming in here. So Heinrich says he's from Ireland. Where else in the world is everybody else from? I like to get that picture of where everybody is. Often we have people
That's
from
great.
India and Dubai sometimes, and depending on the time, sometimes Australia. But
Hmm.
yeah, so my point with the or, the goal of our conversation today is to hopefully demystify some of
Hmm.
the misconceptions around accessibility and also just kind of discuss the importance of it because I think it's a
Hmm.
topic that has a lot of weight in particular right now. So
Hmm.
I'm very excited about that. We have Canada, London, Germany. So we got all kinds, Maryland.
I'm
Uh,
in
Yay!
Maryland.
Pamela Haskell. I don't know if that name rings a bell. Maybe it
Mm-mm.
was a local client for you or something like that. But I told Colleen this before we went live, but if I turn away and start hacking up a lung, I apologize. I haven't felt well the last like 5 days now. So, um, but yeah, so Colleen and I kind of chatted a few weeks ago now. It's flown by.
Hmm.
When we were talking then, we were like, it's going to be a month until today. And here we are. So things have just absolutely
Right.
flown by. Um, but yeah, we chatted before, and you said some really intriguing stuff. So I'm interested as well to talk about kind of the business benefit of
Hmm.
offering accessibility and having that in your toolkit. And then, of course, the practical stuff like making sure you're sort of ahead of the curve and not vulnerable in that area. So
Yes.
there's a million things for us to talk about. But to start off, can you kind of give us, maybe for people that aren't quite sure what accessibility actually means, sort of
Hmm.
the summary, the elevator pitch?
Sure. So accessibility means that you have an electronic communication, like a document, a website, or an app, and the text, the graphics, the functionality, and all the interactive elements in them are accessible to anyone, regardless of any kind of a disability. So it doesn't mean that they have to use a mouse. It doesn't mean that they have to have perfect vision to read your content. If something's not accessible, like to a sighted user who has a visual disability, which could be low vision due to macular degeneration or cataract or diabetic retinopathy or glaucoma, and I'm sure we all know people with these issues, they can't read the content when we make it too light. Heck, some sighted users still can't read it. I'm on websites all the time where I'm like,
Yep.
how did somebody think that everybody would be able to read this? I mean, I have perfect vision almost, and it's like I can't read it. And then you've got people with color blindness who might not be able to make out hyperlinks from the body text because they're only styled with color and the color doesn't stand out enough from the body text. And then you might have someone with a screen reader. And screen readers are not just for blind people, they're also for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. And so someone using a screen reader, if something's not accessible, they can't fill out form fields because they don't understand what the form fields are for. And then somebody with a cognitive disability might not understand how to fill out the form fields because there's a lack of instructions or like how to input that correctly for the proper formatting, like a date field, or that maybe the error messages aren't clear.
Right.
And there could also be a document that you've got where the content is not in the correct order. And the way we see it on a page is not how a screen reader necessarily sees it. And another example would be somebody with a seizure disorder, or they've suffered a traumatic brain injury and they might be triggered by certain colors or motion.
So that's where it starts to get really daunting. I think for probably most people, but me in particular, there's just so many different elements to consider. And when you really sit down, especially for like a client facing project, you have this list of deliverables and all these things to try to achieve in the project. And then you sort of broach the subject of accessibility. My brain just starts to shut down. Building a website is no problem, but bringing in all that other stuff you just talked about, it sounds like we probably, from a structural and a design perspective, make a lot of mistakes. So do you have kind of things that stand out as like typical mistakes that would be easy to rectify?
There are a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of mistakes that I see web designers and developers make. Yeah, I mean, one of them is, the contrast is always an issue. Usually they're using too little. That's the biggest issue when it comes to contrast. I mean, really stark contrast, like black and white, can be problematic for some people, but usually the issue is not enough contrast. Another mistake that I see web designers and developers make is relying on automated checkers and thinking that if I just design this site or build the site and then I run Wave or another automated checker, I'm good if it passes. And that's not the case, because automated checkers only detect about 25 to 30% of accessibility issues. And so just because your site might pass that checker does not mean it's accessible at all. And those checkers also can't say that something was done correctly. So if you've got, like, let's say it's looking for presence of alt text on images. Well, maybe all of your images have alt text. Maybe some of them shouldn't have alt text.
Okay.
And maybe some of them have really bad alt text. Like maybe you or your client has gone in there and put the file name for the image, for example,
Right.
And so there's alt text, but the automated checker can't say, well, hey, that should be different, or that shouldn't be there. And the other thing too is that the mentality about making an accessible site seems to be, I've got to satisfy the WCAG guidelines, which WCAG is WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And a lot of developers are so focused on the guidelines and they think they're going to tick off a list of these guidelines and then call it a day and, hey, my site's accessible now. But that's not the case either, because those are just the guidelines and they're really like the bare minimum. And so you could, and there's so many that are open to interpretation and that are subjective. So you could literally check off a list of the guidelines and then you still have an unusable, not accessible site.
So where does that kind of, I don't know what you'd say, like sort of that threshold exist between not accessible and accessible? Like, is there sort of an entity or some sort of tool you can use, or is it really just your own knowledge of accessibility?
Well, you really do have to have a good understanding of the different types of disability and then disabilities and then how to test for them. But there is no like hard line that's like, your site could be like mostly accessible, not fully accessible. It's not like it's accessible or it's not. I mean, it could be that it has certain issues on it, like, especially when you have clients going in all the time and changing things. I mean,
Right.
it could change on a daily basis, really.
Yep.
I mean, but another thing is like, with an accessible theme, a lot of developers think if I pick an accessible theme that's accessibility ready, that, poof, my site's going to be accessible. But no theme is 100% accessible. And a lot of the ones in the repository that are supposed to be, a lot of them are really crappy.
Gotcha.
But the other thing too is that the theme is not going to do anything with your content. The theme is not going to make the content accessible. So it's about much more than the content. It's not just the structure. It's also the design, and it's also the content. It's just so much more.
So recently, as this topic has been more top of mind for me, I've noticed on a lot of larger sites, especially government sites, that they'll have the little blue, I don't even know what the icon is called, but it looks like a human, like a white little stick figure. And I've noticed a lot of sites have a varying degree of options with that. Some will like have contrast increase,
Mm-hmm.
Some have, font size increases or just different options, but there's not really a standard set. So I imagine some of that's probably around their the optimizations that have already been done on the site. Um, Not really sure where I was going with that question, but my thought was just, it is definitely something that's being addressed on larger sites. So in terms of the typical size of business that's probably watching this, we're definitely smaller. And so I'm curious, what risks are we as the agency and freelancers sort of subjected to, and then also like the
Mm-hmm.
client as well. Sort of what risks for not being accessible to do all of us face?
Well, okay, so let me first really quick address that icon that you're talking about. I
Yeah.
haven't seen it on a government site. That would be really bad, but I see it everywhere on other sites, like commercial sites. So typically those are overlays, and an overlay is like a company that makes overlays says, okay, all you have to do to make your site accessible is to install this line of JavaScript on your site, and poof, your site's accessible. And our AI is going to go in and it's going to change all these things and fix it. No, it doesn't work like that at all. And first, like there's a lot of issues with them because number one, they're a false sense of security, and a lot of developers are using them and putting them on sites. So they're like, that's, that could potentially, I'm not a lawyer, but that
Right.
could potentially, come down on them for making that decision. Overlays don't protect against lawsuits. There's plenty of sites with these overlays on them that are involved in lawsuits. Okay. They don't work. They make usability worse because they force people to go to that site and then use their proprietary interface. So like you're saying, it has like contrast, and then it has like text size or change the font and this and that. That's stuff that already people should be able to do if a site is accessible. So they make it sound like, oh, this is so great. Look at all these features we're serving up on a platter. If the site's already done properly, they don't need any of that. They can already do that. And they know how to do it with the stuff that they're using, whether they're using a mouse or they're using a keyboard, or, they're using a screen reader or another type of assistive software or device. And if you go to these sites and try to get around on a keyboard, I mean, I've done it. I use the keyboard quite a bit, but you go to the site, you try to use the keyboard. I can't get out of some of these, their interfaces. I mean,
Right.
you get trapped in there. So it's like somebody who's used to using, you're used to using a mouse probably. I'm used to using a mouse. If I go to a site and I can't get around on a mouse and someone says, you can't get around our site with a mouse. Now you need to go use a sip and puff system, or you need to use, a keyboard, or you need to use a screen reader to get around. Wouldn't you be like, screw this, I'm just going to go somewhere else,
Yep. Yep.
So that's a big thing. But they also can only detect about 25% of issues. And it's like the automated checkers, right? But they also cannot properly fix a lot of those issues because, again, it's like, could they add alt text to an image? Is it going to be the right alt text? I mean, so, but the other thing is that they slow down websites, and they also, some of them actually detect the use of assistive technology, and that could be seen as discrimination. So having the opposite effect of what they're trying to do.
Gosh.
So they just make everything worse. So they're just delaying the inevitable, which is you got to fix the site. You got to remediate the site. So, okay. So back to answer your question. So about risk, I mean, okay, well, again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV, but I mean, you don't have to be a big company to have the risk. I mean, the US has been going crazy the past 3 years with the lawsuits. A lot of them are lawyers running around running automated checkers on websites and then trying to find low-hanging fruit and saying, okay, your site's not accessible. And so, but from what I understand, if you sue under the ADA, you can't get damages. But what a lot of people end up doing is they just write a check.
Gotcha.
They're not fighting it. They're just writing a check, and that's between like $1,000 to $100,000 potentially, because they've got to pay legal fines and fees for both parties, and they still have to fix the site.
Right.
They still have to fix the site. So,
Yeah.
I mean, someone else could come, like the judge could say, a court could say, okay, you have a year to fix your site or whatever. Somebody else could come along in the meantime and bring another claim against them. And so it's like there's another hit right there.
So you've essentially been dinged 3 times already because you already have the first suit, then you have to pay them, and you still have to fix your site. And
And you
then
still have to fix your site.
there's still the risk of somebody else coming along, like you said. Yeah, that's really horrible. So there's a question in chat which is kind of connected to what we're talking about right now, and that is there a way for a web designer or an agency freelancer, whatever, to sort of absolve themselves of the risk, or is it on them even if they get the client to sign some sort of document that says, we talked about accessibility and they declined it?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that because that's definitely legalese I would recommend you consult an attorney about.
Right.
Talk to them about your risks, talk to them about your contracts and the kind of liability that you might be taking on. But getting things in writing. I mean, I've had, even when working on documents, like I've made certain suggestions to a client, and if they don't agree or if they don't want me to do a certain thing, and I'm like, this is really what we need to do, and they're like, no, I don't want to do that because whatever, I'm like, put it in writing because I don't want that coming back on me.
Right.
So yeah.
So I think most of the conversations, or at least in the circles that I'm in, are typically relatively, what's the word? Not sort of uninformed conversations around accessibility for the most part. And a lot of it comes back to kind of the scary stuff, being sued, all of that sort of thing. But I think the more important opportunity for pretty much everybody listening would be the chance to be the person talking about accessibility to your current clients and also offering it to future clients. And that, you said that when we talked before, and that was super intriguing to me. So I was curious, either for people that you consult with or for your own business, how do you see that as an offering really benefiting these sorts of agencies and freelancers?
Oh, well, there's a lot. So there's benefits for your clients, but there's also benefits for you. So for your clients, they can, if their site's not accessible, that could be loss of revenue, because the Click Away Pound survey in the UK, it was a UK study, found that 71% of people with a disability who go to a site that's not accessible will leave. And of course, they're going to go somewhere else. So if someone else's site is easier to use, that's where they're going to do business.
Right.
And there's also, but that's also affected the business's reputation, because there's also a stat that people with a disability are 3 times as likely to avoid a business and twice as likely to tell others not to do business with it. And I mean, you don't have to have a disability to be like, everybody's like that. We're always going to talk about our experience, whether it's good or bad. And, word of mouth and like Google reviews and Facebook reviews, they have a lot of cred. They can help or hurt a business. The other thing too is that it can be positive for a business's reputation, right? It's being seen as inclusive. So that attracts more people. So that's a benefit. Brand recognition can be affected if the site is not accessible, because if you start out with like if you have an accessible color palette that you're starting out with, right? Because it's all trickles down from there. It starts there. It starts with those visual brand elements. If you have to go and change somebody's brand colors later to make them work together properly and be accessible, I mean, you could be changing the whole like effect of the design or their brand colors. And, that's not good. It's not only potentially alienating people that recognize them by those colors, because that's how our brain works. We do associate those colors with certain businesses. And it's going to be costly because they have to revisit the design process again. And so it's costing them time, it's costing them money, it's costing them potential customers. And then also the cost of remediation. If this is thought about later and you've got to redesign a website, redesign a whole brand color palette, redesign documents so everything is cohesive, because you don't want, the site to be accessible and then it has this color palette, and then you've got documents over here, like your marketing materials, and they're like they look totally different.
Right.
So that's a biggie too. But another thing is that having an accessible site, it will help with search engine rank, because it's using proper semantic code, which is typically leaner and not bloated. And when you have a faster site, then Google's going to give it a bump in the search engine results. So that could be a leg up over a competitor.
Yeah. So not only did you, approach them as the first person to talk about accessibility, but also Google might potentially be rewarding you in a small way as well.
Right. So this would be for the business where the business ranks.
Right,
But
right.
then, if it's also serving more relevant content to somebody in the search results, so they're more likely to stay on the site. And so that could reduce the bounce rate. And like for web developers and designers themselves, personally speaking, from 5 years of doing this so far, when you're a web developer, you're like a fish in the sea. You're if you don't know what separates you from others, you could easily lose out on projects because clients don't necessarily see the differentiation. When you start talking about accessibility, it helps you stand out more from others, and because they're not talking about it. So if you're the one bringing it up, you're seen as more the expert, and then that client's going to go, wait, why aren't these other people I got, estimates from, why aren't they bringing this up? Right.
Yep.
Shouldn't they know about that? Because you're probably talking about SSL and you're probably talking about privacy policies. So why aren't you bringing up accessibility? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I really never had to go looking for work. I've always been fortunate with that over the past, almost 20 years I've had my business. But with accessibility, it's like people come from all over the world and they're like, I need you to do this, I need you to do that. Like it's been like a whole nother level.
So that's actually a great segue, because I saw a message pop up in chat around who do you go to if you're looking for like an accessibility audit? Like who are the people or the services that are qualified to give you a proper audit, so you could go to a client and say, I found these issues, we can address them for X price. Is that something you offer?
Yes, I do that. And then there's an organization, the IAAP, the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and there's a lot of auditors there as well. But with an audit, what happens is, there's a price for the audit. I just did a 140-page, well, the report was 140 pages. The audit was for, I think 20 pages on the site. And
that's a lot.
Yeah. So typically an audit's not done of every single page because the cost is just so prohibitive. But so that report that I did was 140 pages. And that audit cost them several $1,000s. Okay. Now they have to take that report to a developer. And that developer is going to have to tell them how much all that stuff's going to cost.
So that's a great point, because I've had this conversation with a few people in my close circle, and we've talked about, you're bidding on, let's say, like a $6,500 site. And then if you consider the idea of accessibility, you're probably doubling that price. So
I wouldn't say that you're doubling it.
No?
It depends on all that's in it, right? If you've got tons of audio and video, right? If you've got tons of images, if you've got like e-commerce on there, it really depends. And then it's like, who's responsible for what? Is the client going to be responsible for, formatting all their content and doing the alt text? Who's going to be doing that? There might be some custom dev work you have to do. Like we usually do a lot of custom dev work in the back end, but when you have the best practices built into your like workflow, there's a lot that gets covered there. And It's the same thing with documents. It's like, if you know how to, if you're using the best practices, it's going a long way. If you're already not coding websites properly, like using semantic tags, for instance, you're going to have issues because you need to relearn about HTML5 and you need to now go back and do things the proper way the first time, because otherwise you're going to be like trying to add a whole bunch of code to try to fix things when it can be fixed with the right tag to begin with.
So these semantic tags are things that are as simple as like making sure your header has a header tag, and like your footer is footer, and like the relatively basic HTML semantics that's built right in, correct? That's what you're talking about? So
yes.
A button is tagged as button, like a link is, A or whatever. Is that essentially what you're talking about? Yes,
that's what I'm referring to.
Okay.
Yes. Now there's that. Just because you do that though, doesn't mean there's nothing else to do. There's still a lot that needs to be done, and adding in certain like labels to tell like a screen reader or other assistive technology, okay, like this is not like, this might be the main site navigation, but this one is a different navigation. There's different customizations and things to add in to make sure that it's still the proper experience. But knowing the semantic tags and using them properly, goes a long way. I mean, I've seen so many sites that just throw in divs everywhere, and it's like,
Guilty as
you know.
charged.
I mean, divs are okay. Divs are okay to use. Don't get me wrong. They're okay to use, but not for semantic, right?
Okay.
So you wouldn't want to just be like, okay, this navigation is in a div and no nav tag.
Right. Right.
You can put a nav in a div. That's fine. You can use divs to style all you like. It's just where the semantic tag should be used, a semantic tag should be used.
Okay, got it.
So you might be okay there.
Yeah, hopefully so, because I do that. But that's probably about it as far as my accessibility, knowledge goes. So I'm curious. A lot of the people that are listening to this and probably will watch this in the future are going to be Oxygen Builder users, and you can add your own custom attributes to elements. So that's something that I don't know is possible in most other builders, maybe Elementor, but I don't think very many. So I'm curious, when I did a little bit of research a couple weeks ago, I kept finding like Aria labels and Aria attributes. I think I'm saying that right. AIRA. And that seemed to be a really big piece of the puzzle, in particular for screen readers. So is that something, I guess the question really comes down to, what are the main components that somebody like myself that's building websites often should really focus on? Because I think the ecosystem is just too big to try to know everything. So if there are some things for us to focus on immediately, do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, I would definitely say focus on semantic tags and making sure that you're using them properly. I mean, a big mistake I see a lot of developers make is throwing Aria in there, like wherever, like on everything.
Okay.
And you don't want to use it unless you have to.
Gotcha.
So it's like, use the proper tags first. Use Aria to flavor something if you need to, but not to replace the functionality.
So Aria is almost secondary to building the site in a logical way, is what you're saying.
Yes, you can use it like as a complement, but it shouldn't replace the proper tags.
Okay.
Because a lot of times I see developers throwing Aria in there and it's actually undoing things. Like they think it's doing one thing, it's actually undoing that and then doing something completely different.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
so it can really muck things up and make things worse.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I know there's a lot of people that will build sites sort of from their own creativity without starting from like a mock-up or a spec before it goes into the dev stage. So I imagine that probably is something that would be a little tricky from an accessibility standpoint. So when you're working with clients, are you starting with something like, XD mock-ups and building it from that and then turning it into a site? Or what does a accessible workflow look like?
Well, what I do, just because I do this a certain way doesn't mean that if somebody does it a different way, it wouldn't be accessible. But what I do is we will do a design and then show it to the client after we make sure it's accessible, because you don't want to just show a client a design and then they're like, okay, great. And then you go and like check it, right, for accessibility. And then you're like, okay, well, I had to change this and I had to change that. Now you have a totally different look and feel to it as different colors. So that's what we do. We'll show the design first and get that approved
as like a functioning site, right? Not in
no.
Okay.
No. I mean, we just do it like as a PDF and send it to them, or use it and get notes from them, or use InVision. But no, it's just a static mock-up. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't. I mean, you certainly could do something that's like that. But I'm old school. I mean, I've been doing this for like almost 25 years, so I'm kind of stuck in my old ways.
No, I mean that's exactly how I do it. But I think a large majority of at least the audience here on this channel indicated to me in a survey I did a while back that they design in the builder, which I found surprising as compared to, for me, I like to do it outside in specifically in Figma. So by the time you have a design done and the client's seen it, you've already considered accessibility. You know exactly how it's all going to work. So translating it into the site is not copy and paste, but it's relatively straightforward. There's not surprises during the development, basically, when it comes to accessibility.
No. And so it's just part of our process. It took me like maybe a year and a half or something to like really refine my process over like with all the stuff that we needed to include in the process, because I was doing this by myself first, and I had to, put all these things into like a giant task list, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
detail, and so I mean my checklist is like 9 pages long at this point. It's like really long. If I have to keep adding to it, I will. So but yeah, it's just, incorporate it into the process, and then it's not so much like, oh, I have to do this and add it on later kind of thing,
Yeah.
because that's where it starts adding money. If you're not already doing things a certain way, then you're changing up your process every single time, and you're adding more time and you're adding more work. But if you're just changing the way you work and incorporating things, it just makes it easier.
Yep.
Like, it's a lot of upfront work the first few times, right? But then it just becomes part of your process. And,
So it's really interesting because as we're talking about this more, it's like there's essentially no way to automate the process. It's a very human focused effort. So like
yes,
someone like you has to go into a site and basically audit it. And I think probably for a lot of us, typically clients are coming to me with existing sites. They want to completely redo it. So where at that point would somebody like myself come to you and say, all right, we have maybe like a wireframe or the mock-up ready. Can you accessibility audit? Can you do that from a flat design, or does it need to be an actual site?
Yes. So when I've had requests for accessibility help where somebody wants to design a new site and then they want to and then build a new one, what I always say to them is, I'm like, before you show anything to the client, design wise, show it to me so I can make sure that there's no potential issues there. And then after they show it to the client and get approval, typically what I'll do is advise them on, okay, here's like the tags that you want to use, for these things.
Okay.
And so then they'll go ahead and they'll do all the work. And they'll build it out, and then I review it in the process, because it's very important to bring accessibility into your processes early on. Like I was mentioning earlier about like the brand color palette. I mean, if you do any logo design, you need to be talking about it at that stage, because everything is trickling down from there. So if you throw it in at the end of the process and just like tack it on, you got to go back and backpedal and redo things, So yeah, if somebody comes to me and they're like, I need your help with this, that's the first thing I say. Don't wait until the site is built and the client's looked at it. I mean,
right.
Bring me into the process right away with the design. I'll advise you on that. And then you can proceed to the next stage, and then I'll advise you on that.
So there is an element of this that's maybe a bit scary. When I heard you earlier talking about sort of the color changes and logo kind of branding elements, especially with established businesses, I find a lot of times they have a tendency to resist the change. So I'm curious how you've approached that with clients that are like, no, we love our logo, but let's say it's not accessible. How do you deal with a situation like that?
Well, at least right now, logos do not need to meet a contrast requirement. But here's a great example. Right. But here's the problem with that. Even though a logo doesn't need to meet contrast requirements, and again, that could change in the future. Here's a great example of why this is a problem. So my Grotzer graphics business, I have a light green and gray logo, and I created that long before I knew anything about accessibility, right? Well, when I started looking at making my site more accessible, which I'm still working on because I've just been so busy with the accessibility work, but my colors are the green and the gray, and neither one of them works against white. So a white background, right? Most people have a white background for their website. Well, I was like, okay, I need to introduce a third color, an accent color. And I wanted to use like a violet color. The problem is that the changes that I've had to make so far, it's now so heavy on purple. It's super heavy on purple. I really liked my light green and the gray. And it's like, okay, so you have a situation like that. It's like, here's your accent color now it's super dark, right? It's being used in most situations for text, unless it's even if it's against the green. It works against white. It works against green. I think it works against gray as large text only or something. But okay. It's like, okay, so now I've got this site that I don't want to be that heavy on purple because that's like my accent color. So, you can really get yourself into a lather there with the colors if you're not thinking about this. It's like, I could use it here and I could use it here, but I don't want my site to be that heavy on that color. I don't want it to be that dark. And, a lot of designers think accessibility is about designing with dark colors. It's not, it's how they're used
Okay.
together. Okay. So it's just the big problem is that I have two colors that I started with that don't work against white and they don't work against each other. So
that's super
it's
interesting.
now I've got this problem.
Yeah, for sure. I live in an area where the water is like emerald green, and so every business calls themselves Emerald something. They have an emerald element, and I'm just thinking about all the different businesses and sites that I visit where that emerald is, typically on top of white, and the contrast is pretty poor. So how that clearly that's not accessible. I'm just thinking about now being aware of this, like all the different implications that it could have. Talking about from the core of your design out to everything else in the business. So it's definitely
right. Well, you could sometimes you can change a design to make the colors work. Like a lot of times I'll remediate InDesign files, which are going to be exported to PDFs. And I will get handed like fully done client approved InDesign files, and they're like, make this accessible. And I'm like, okay, I should have been brought in earlier, but okay. So, I mean, it's going through the design process again, because I'm like, okay, we can do this or we can do this, because it's like, as a designer, I don't want to go and change something if I don't have to in that respect. But I mean, I sometimes have to say, here are your options, or here's your only option, or I might have to change the design in order to get their colors to work. So it could be a drastically different design that uses those original colors, or it could be, nope, we got to change this. That's just how it is, but here's your options,
That's really interesting. It's kind of yeah, so really the successful projects, or maybe not successful, the most seamless ones are when you've been involved from the very beginning before the
for
client
sure
has seen anything.
Yeah, well, that's also going to cost somebody a lot less,
Right.
because some of these InDesign files I've worked on, like one I work on every year. Now it's like 400 pages. It's an annual report. When I was first brought in, that cost them probably 3 times what it should have, because it was fully done and presented to me. And I'm like, there's a lot I need to change in here. And not only that, the file wasn't even set up properly from a technical standpoint. So I had to redo all that, because it's not just the design. It's also like with a website, it's also the structure of the document. So I had to redo everything.
Man.
And I'm like, so they've just hired me ever since then to do it from the beginning, because, it cost them that much money. It might have been more. It could have been 4 or 5 times what they paid for it. I don't know, but it was a lot of money. It was a lot, because they thought about it later,
right,
and then ended up taking a lot of extra time because they weren't expecting that.
So there was one question, which I think we already touched on a bit, which was if we redid our workflow, is there significant difference in time and effort in the design and development process, or is all the work really in redoing the process? So I guess the question is, once you get familiar with that, then it becomes quicker down the line, if I understood the question properly.
It becomes quicker, sure. Are there other things to do? Yes. I mean, you're still going to do, like, you might be normally like testing in different browsers, right, as part of your workflow. But now you might need to check with, the keyboard and screen readers and things like that. You're doing additional testing, in other words, that that you wouldn't necessarily do in your workflow. So there's going to be that. There's going to be other modifications you might need to make to the code in order to make sure that it's more accessible and user friendly.
So like for me, a pretty typical site would be maybe 10 to 15 pages. So if I'm sure it's hard to estimate without having an actual site, but I was just curious from like a general perspective, if I came to you with a site of that size, and let's say it was really, really bad, are we talking like 10 hours of development remediation, or are we talking 50, or what do you typically see in like a maybe best case and a worst case scenario, if you can even estimate?
Gosh, I can't estimate, but I'll do the audit, but I don't want to do the remediation work.
Okay.
I stay out. I stay out of that. Like
right.
My designer will help me with design work, and my developer, like I trained them both I trained my designer in InDesign accessibility. I trained my developer in accessibility, but I still advise and I still oversee, and I'm very involved in all of that. But I don't want any part of the remediation. Like, I'm just like, I have too much work that I'm like, somebody else can do that. Like, let me focus on my expertise.
Right.
So I mean, some remediation, I'm sure much of it's going to be more than 10 hours. I mean, from some of the audits that I've done, there's definitely more than 10 hours worth of work. But I mean, again, it depends on it depends on so many factors.
Right. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, because the content, it's, if you had like, if somebody doesn't have transcripts, with their audio, or they don't have transcripts and captions with their video, I
Mm.
mean, who's going to do that? Is the client going to go do that? Are you going to have to go do that? There's a lot of different factors, and it's like, what's on their site to begin with? They have tons of images, tons of video. So it depends. I mean, and
Man.
it depends on the complexity. And that's how I pick out pages for an audit, because it's not just, okay, the site is small, I only need to audit a few pages. It's, I want to make sure that I'm looking at a good variety of content to make sure I'm covering like all possible scenarios, right?
Gotcha.
So it'll be like, the homepage. The homepage is always like a unique page, right?
Yep.
And then a page with a form, a page with a video, a page with tons of images, or a gallery. Like, I'll look out for different types of pages like that, different page templates, like a blog or events or something, a calendar. So that's how I pick them out. So you can have a small site, and I might audit every single page of that site.
Got
You might
it.
have a huge site, and maybe only 5 pages need to be audited, and I mean, I one time redesigned and completely rebuilt a client's site myself. This is before, I had my developer working with me, and I went through all 80 pages and remediated all of their content myself after designing it, developing it myself. That was like over 100 hours, I think. It was a lot.
Crazy.
It
Yeah.
was a lot, because I did all the design, I did all the dev myself, custom dev, custom page templates, and then I remediated the content on every single page.
So that does make sense then. So you really need to consider what almost like categories or what unique layouts you have. So if you have like you said, a blog template, it's going to be essentially the same thing. So you don't have to do every blog post. It's sort of
Correct. Right. Like, so you
grouping.
do you could do like your main blog page, and then a single post page, and then an archive page. Right.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That actually sounds more reasonable. And the reason why I asked that question is because I was thinking about a number of my current like care plan clients and how basically every single one of them needs this audit now. And all of them have a varying degree of types of content, but they're all roughly in the same sort of quantity. So yeah, it's really getting my gears turning for my own clients. From like I feel like when you start talking about this to them, suddenly your pipeline is going to be completely full of current clients wanting to revisit this. Do you find people when you educate them on it are eager to get started, or is it something that people are still sort of on the fence about?
Well, usually like 9 out of 10 times people are just coming to me. They already know they have a need for it. And they're like, I've heard about you on your podcast, or I heard you have courses, or I heard you do this, and they'll just come to me. They're already aware of they need to have this done. So they just reach out to me.
Okay.
I mean, I've had a few clients in the past, ironically, one that was a nonprofit serving people with disabilities, and it took them a while to really get on board, but eventually they did. But I'm just like,
Right.
But yeah, but I mean, I'm not, I don't know. People just come to me. They come to me and they're like, I need this done.
That's a beautiful spot to be in.
Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot you could do with your care plans too with this. I mean, you could add a lot of extra revenue every month with care plans.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
There's so many things you could do with that.
From, I'm thinking about from sort of like a project fee to sort of get these sites accessible, but from a monthly perspective in a care plan, what opportunities exist there?
Well, I mean, you could do checks.
Okay.
You could perform checks. Like, I mean, you can't just be like, okay, I'm just going to run an automated checker every month, and then, I'm going to fix those things, because you have to understand that they have limitations. They'll give you false positives, and so you might think you're like, you got to fix something that you don't have to fix.
Right.
So you really have to understand something about accessibility before you just go running around relying on checkers. That's a big issue, relying on the checkers. You can't rely on the tool. You have to understand more about accessibility. So once you have a basic understanding of it, there are things you can start doing, and like some checks, and you can like do those things in phases. It's like as part of a care plan over time, and
like a quarterly accessibility audit even.
I mean, it could be that. I mean, it could be doing smaller things every single month. Maybe they enter their content, and then you go in and fix it and check it or something. I mean,
Gotcha.
there's lots of different opportunities for you to do something there.
So I was gonna throw it out because I know we're coming
Mm-hmm.
close to our hour here, but I was gonna offer anybody in chat, if you have a question, throw that out. And while we're waiting for that to come through, you mentioned you have a podcast, you have some courses.
Mm-hmm.
So talk us through some of the stuff that we can find more from on you.
So my podcast is Design Domination, and I do talk about accessibility sometimes, but I also talk about creative business issues that designers and developers have, a lot of mindset issues and business issues, how to charge more, how to stand out more. And then my courses, I have an accessible branding and design course, which is web designers could take it, but it's really targeted towards non-web designers. So somebody who's designing logos or who might be doing, document design, publication design, or any other kind of design. But even if they're just doing web design, if they're not doing the technical, that helps them go through that whole accessibility and design process, and but I don't get into any of the technical there. Now, then I have a Foundations of Website Accessibility course where I do get into all of that, plus all of the technical.
Okay.
So it's not just, and my approach is very different in that I don't focus on WCAG. My course is not like you're just going to go in there and learn WCAG and I'm going to rattle off a whole bunch of guidelines and tell you how to meet them. I don't get into that. If you focus on WCAG, like I said, you can end up with an inaccessible site. So my approach is very plain English. Like, do you want to know what to do? You can read the WCAG guidelines and you're still like, what the heck do I do?
Yep.
I just tell you, here's what to do. You got a form, you need to do this. You've got colors, here's what you need to do. Here's the code that you need to use to put that in there, because and this process that I have is just, it's based on accessibility, but also usability and best practices. So it's just plain English, and I have tons of worksheets and checklists to help you talk about it with clients, from the sales process all the way down to checking your work and making sure that the site is accessible.
So, sorry, go ahead. Didn't mean to cut you
I was
off.
just going to say, because for anyone that attended this talk today, I'm offering a discount code of $50 off the web course with the code PermaSlug.
Awesome.
And that'll only be till the end of the month.
Perfect.
But if anybody has any questions on that, I'm happy to answer them.
Beautiful. So part of that brought up a question in my mind when, let's say we've gone through your course. Mm-hmm. And you feel pretty confident, you've addressed the site, you've gotten it to an accessible perspective. Is there some sort of authority that certifies that? Or is it really just, you've met the criteria and you can feel confident that it is accessible and that's basically done?
Right. So you'll know, like when you get to the end, I have a lot of different ways for you to verify that.
Okay. So
yes,
there's not some central authority that you would go to and they like give you a thumbs up. It's more about you've hit the criteria.
And I've never. No.
Okay. I wasn't sure if there's like, some little badge you can like stick on the site that's like, we've done this and.
I mean, I think there are some companies that offer that. I've never looked into them. I've never used them. I don't know how much credibility that has, but yeah. And like I said, like a site, you don't have to, when you build a site, it doesn't need to be, it's not like it's going to ever be 100% accessible, right?
Right.
It's 100% accessibility is just like, so whatever you can do to incorporate some accessibility practices is going to go a long way. You don't have to know everything. And the other thing about like with my web course is that at the end of every single module, I tell you what you can do right now, because you don't have to go wait and take the whole course and then, okay, now I'm done. Now I can go build accessible sites. You can start doing it as soon as you watch every single module. Because I say, okay, now you go to this. I mean, you obviously don't have to, right. But it's like, now you can go do this. You could go to your clients and say this or do this. And so you can start implementing the stuff that you learn every single time.
Yeah, that's really valuable, because I think you're going to have to build on that over time. So with that, a question that I was thinking about was if you're, let's say, going through the course and, well, actually, let me rephrase it. So if you're new to this process, which I imagine many of us would be, does it make sense to start off with sort of the human audit from you? And then maybe as we get more experienced, then the course and some of the learnings from the audits would then give us enough experience to do it ourselves? Or is it something that it still makes sense to have someone like yourself do the audit, even still later?
Well, I would say, I mean, with the audit, I'm not giving training. So it's like you might learn something from the audit, but it's not going to suddenly make you understand accessibility. It's just going to tell you how to fix the things that are wrong. It's not going to tell you what you did right. It's not going to tell you everything that I checked, because audit reports are typically just here's what needs to be corrected.
Gotcha.
So and that's going to cost you a lot more than my course.
Right.
But if you go through the course, you can know nothing about accessibility and you'll still come out. I mean, every single one of my students has loved it. I've had students that knew nothing, and I've had students who are already building accessible sites, and everybody has given me wonderful feedback on it. So it doesn't matter what level, it's going to answer like a whole bunch of questions, for you through the process.
Awesome. So that's a really rounded like solution for people. There's either the DIY course option or potentially the audit, or both. And yeah, that's extremely helpful. So the Michael in chat asked, what's the link to the course? Your website is creativeboost.com, right?
Oh, creative-boost.com/courses, or just go to creative-boost.com and click on the top. Thank you so much for since I forgot to mention it.
Yeah, no worries. I'll make sure to put that in the link in the description, obviously, so people can get to that as well. So we are coming up here on time. Does anybody have any other questions before we close out? I wanted to make sure I covered everything. I think we did. Any other thoughts for us accessibility noobs?
Well, you could, okay, so okay, so a lot of designers and developers are intimidated with accessibility. So what I want to say is that please don't be intimidated, because you know more than the client does. And even if you are like, oh, I know nothing, you still know more. Even just learning anything from this today, I mean, you still know more. And you don't have to be able to answer every single question that they have for you. It's not your job to understand all of their legal requirements. They have a part in this too. It's not all about you, and it all comes down to your responsibility. It is a shared responsibility for everyone. And so if you just start talking about it and bringing it up, and if you don't know an answer, then, ping me or ping another accessibility professional in the space, and just, or get out there and participate in some discussions about this and start learning it. But like I said, don't be intimidated. Just keep learning. I'm always still learning. There's so much to know in this field. I mean, there's so many different like subfields of it,
Yeah.
So just start somewhere and don't get overwhelmed, and just, bring it up to clients, tell them why it's important, give them some facts about it and about the benefits, talk to them about the benefits, talk to them about the risks, and just go from there. And even if they don't seem receptive to it now, doesn't mean they won't come back later, because this is only becoming a bigger issue. And it's like, you want to be the one that tells your clients, hey, we need to get in front of this, because this is not going away.
Right.
And you're going to get left behind, the clients will get left behind if their site's not accessible. But as web developers and designers, you'll eventually get left behind if you're not getting into this. Because like I said, it's like, you're probably talking about privacy policies, and you're probably talking about SSL. Need to start talking about accessibility.
Yeah.
This is just going to become, a bigger thing, and it's going to become more of the norm. I mean, I see it all the time from panicked designers. Oh my God, my client mentioned accessibility. What do I do? And everybody tags me all over Facebook. And I'm like, oh dear, and a couple of them, their clients got sued, and they were small businesses, and they're like, what do I do? And,
that seems like maybe a tad too late from that perspective. Like you're already in the weeds. So really, based on what you're saying, it's like getting yourself way out ahead of the curve, or potentially being way, way behind the curve.
Oh, for sure. And like I said, it's going to help your business too. You don't have to know everything about this topic to get in front of it and start talking about it. Just do it. And yeah, I mean, it's going to, like I said, it's going to set you apart. They're going to remember you for that, because nobody else is probably talking about it. None of their if they have anyone else they use for anything, they're probably not talking about it. And so you can't just put your head in the sand.
Right. Absolutely.
So get out and start talking about it and use it to your advantage. Like even if nothing else, use it to your advantage for that reason. Even though it's a good thing to do, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. It benefits everybody in the long run,
yes.
Ultimately. Like
yes.
The accessible user, you as the business owner, and the client, like everybody wins.
Right. Because accessibility is useful for some, but it's essential for some, but useful for all.
Yeah.
Like everybody's getting older. You're gonna have a vision issue at some point. You might break your arm in an accident and not be able to use a mouse.
Yep.
There's temporary disabilities too.
True.
So it's just, yeah.
It's a fascinating topic, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and educate us. I'm really excited about the course and like bringing up these topics with clients. It's something that I think I've become more what's the word, like aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you're not on the app called Clubhouse, there's a group in there that there's a few accessible users in there. There's a totally blind web developer in there, and she's fascinating, and it really has made me think like about that as a real need. It's one thing to talk about it, but then to hear somebody needing that in their day-to-day life, maybe kind of flip the importance switch. So I'm really excited to address that.
I've been contacted by podcast listeners who have blindness, and they're like, I can go to your site and I can easily get the information, and I love it. And I'm like, okay, great. That's so nice to hear. And
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, cool. I didn't see much else coming through in chat. There was one question, which I understand if we don't have time for, but Jason asks, how do you test a screen reader? Is there a specific program, or is that something that's just sort of taken care of in the accessibility process?
So a screen reader, there's lots of screen readers, but the top three are VoiceOver, which is built into the Mac operating system. And for PC, the top two are NVDA, which is free, and then JAWS.
Okay, cool. So the NVDA one you could install and start using.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. That's
But
really
make
good
sure
to know.
you know how to turn these things off once you turn them on. Like before you even turn it on, make sure you know how to turn it off. The other day I had one on and I forgot that I had it on, and I left the room and I was in the kitchen and I said, oh my God, where's that voice coming from? And I forgot that I had left a screen reader on and it hadn't talked in a while. So I was testing out a document and I'm like, oh no. I was like, it just was really creepy.
That's amazing. I love it. Well, we are exactly at an hour, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you to everyone that joined us, and thank you, Colleen,
thank you
so much.
And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, definitely. I certainly
I also
will.
have a Facebook group too that's called Design Domination, so feel free to connect with me there as well. And thank you so much for the opportunity, Jonathan.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. To everybody on YouTube, sayonara, and we will see you soon.
Awesome.
Beautiful.